Howdy, howdy. We are embarking on quite the journey here. This is a pretty complex way of looking at planning. So it's unit planning, it's interdisciplinary, and it's using the framework of thriving theory. We got a lot of work to do here. I will say this much, it would probably take even the average teacher a couple years of teaching this way to really get a hold of it or understand it or whatever. It would, yeah. This is not something that's gonna just, work overnight, right? So this is pretty intense kind of stuff. So, in the planning itself, right, you got to kind of go through all the steps here. But first and foremost is thinking about some kind of theme that deals with social sustainability, ecological sustainability, or the way in which that they are interconnected with one another, right? So, yeah, that right there is probably a lot to even consider because this is not typically how we teach right now. So, the framework, just as a reminder, is really the three parts. It's individual well-being that leads to a larger collective well-being, right? So it could be a community of people who have a higher level of well-being collectively. Lovely. Wouldn't that be lovely just to have that, right? The second part here, it looks at external, especially external sustainability. So you have sort of your own internal sustainability, right, well-being, as it is sort of connected to the external well-being, which is social and ecological, and how those are connected to each other, and how we are individually connected to all of that too. So all of those interconnections. And then last is really whatever we think that thriving community is. So we have sort of the base of individual well-being. We have these sustainabilities and on all of their interconnections. And then that thriving community that's actively working against greed based problems, right? Which is a very long list of things that come out of greed. So it would also be the not just, and I hope this is clear at this point, um, but it's not just the identification of all the problems, right? Although that's step one. It's also the manifestation of the thriving itself. In other words, putting the thriving practices into the real world, right? Really enacting them. So there's sort of a breakdown here again, right? Liberation from greed ideology. This is not just a let's take our current society right now and have more personal success within it. That is not what we're talking about. We are talking about an actual transformation of our society towards a thriving, theory-based existence. So step one is identifying the problems and really working on transitioning from that. This is not something that can also be done overnight. It is something that's going to take years and probably at least a couple of generations of really hard thinking and practicing and trialing to see what is going to really work here, what's needed. So we have a very tall order in front of us right now, for sure. But you gotta start somewhere, right? And education's role in this is an important one. So again, you see those aspects of the learning theory there: well-being, sustainability, thriving, and then sort of the integrative mindset that is needed to keep an eye on all of these things and think about it and come up with practices and be community-based and place-based and local and seeing the connections with global. There's a lot here to keep thinking about, right? So that's what this is about. It's just a reminder, because I've talked about this in other videos, that you have to have, if you're going to teach about this, you have to build that integrative mindset, right? So you have to, as a teacher, I mean, it may be something that you personally have to work on, because I think most of us are probably at very, very beginning stages, if at all, when it comes to this, right? But this is a sort of learning as we're teaching, and that's okay, because we really need to do this. There's really not much of an option left at this point. So the yellow arrows and the oval there are really just about making sure that we're paying attention to the interconnections, and that's what the integrative mindset is really about. And that's complex, right? This is just scraping the surface here visually, just to give us kind of understanding, but that's where we're at. So there's many choices in terms of topics that you can look through here. So this would be sort of the social sustainability topics. Liberation from greed, exploration of and transition to thriving ideology, thriving theory, just those alone, right? That's a philosophical and social theory work there. Cooperative living practices, what are those? Democratic decision making, let's get more into that with our students. Wouldn't that be lovely? How social justice and personal liberties impact one another. The idea here being that they're not at odds with one another, even though we are so incredibly divisive and polarizing around those two topics, that they're in many ways one and the same, right? Social justice really is about issues of personal liberties. And the only thing that we have there that creates a divisiveness is the just the overall denial at a social level, even though at the personal level, the very people who are experiencing injustices, oftentimes are the people who are denying it at a societal level. So that's where we're at. Yay, humans. Solidarity with difference. Solidarity is a word that's really important here because it denotes the sort of, I'll just put it this way, equal membership, and I don't have to, you don't need me to acknowledge that for you to have it, like you already should have it. And whether or not I am at a place where I understand what that is, it should not be contingent upon you actually having it. Although, the better version of that is me understanding it, not that you need my permission for it, and our overall commitment to making sure that that remains. Right. So there's solidarity with difference. Difference is very much a good thing. Uh, we, we we flourish when we have difference. We are not all the same, right? Which is oftentimes the feel good way of viewing things is we're all the same. We're not all the same, and that's not the intention. The intention is to be differentiated human beings who have different experiences, right? That is okay. That is good. That is what this planet is about. So yeah, right. We have different species. We have different humans. We have different ways of thinking. We have different experiences. We should celebrate those, while also recognizing that we are interconnected, right? And that maybe there is some sort of common energetic root that we share that we can tap into, but also recognizing in the very same way the beauty of the differences that we have, and that it's not okay to exploit based on difference. It's not okay to exploit, period, but certainly not based on difference, right? And of course, acknowledging that people are going through higher levels of exploitation depending on their difference right now, right? Wouldn't that be nice if we can all just rally around that thought? But, right now we're struggling with that. Lots of white people in denial, of course. Why wouldn't there be? Ethical cultural hybridity, meaning that as we grow as a society and we have difference culturally and otherwise, but not about co-opting folks' cultures, but about having a respectful appreciation, even if there is engagement, that it's still a respect of where it's coming from, and that it's something that we can hybridize, but we can do so in a way where it's caring and respectful and acknowledging where things are coming from and all that, right? Not erasing the history of it and making it your own, which we see a lot of in our society. We see, examples of that. You see Americans oftentimes taking Eastern philosophies and spiritualities and turning it into their own, with sometimes with a very disrespectful way of co-opting it. Other times, a very respectful way. That's just one of many examples, and it's got to be something that you do very thoughtfully and respectfully. It's cultural hybridity is, is something that's ultimately going to happen, but and has happened all throughout history. But when it's a group that's currently positioned in the dominance, um, culturally hybridizing with somebody who's directly subordinated, you have a real dynamic there that you have to pay attention to, and now may not be the time, right? Uh, but maybe it is. So there needs to be a very concerted look at that. And wouldn't it be lovely for our kids to really grapple with some of those tensions and understand what that means and how we go about it and so forth. And I can talk about this for hours. I'm going on to the next one. Peaceful, nonviolent practices of communication and deliberation. God, if I see debate in school one more time, I'm just going to keel over and die. Wouldn't it be better at this point for us to have deliberation, which means that we work on a problem together and deliberate on what possibilities there could be, as opposed to compete in these entrenched binary ways? Okay, that's what I think of debate. Dismantling conditions that create ideological blindness, which is really just extremeness or extremism. We should also really, in addition to understanding these extreme versions of ideology, sort of within that, come to a space where we see what ideological dead ends are. Where somebody is forced into thinking a specific certain way, and there's not really a way out, right? There's this sort of dead end. Whether they've been forced overtly by somebody or somebody in the group, or they're kind of doing it to themselves. Uh, all of that, right? There's ideological blindness, or sort of blind spots, right? Something that maybe someone is not necessarily intending for, but because of their experiences, again, oftentimes white people, not having a full view of what's going on, and having then blind spots, and then making assumptions, at the very least, making assumptions, if not worse. So there's some ideological blindness, and then we have ideological dead ends, and then we have ideological extremism. Ideological dead ends you see kind of all over our society right now because we can't, keep ourselves open to critically questioning things. So it means you got to lock down, oftentimes out of insecurity and feeling threatened. You got to lock down on whatever side you're on, and again, another topic I can go on for hours and hours and hours, which I will not. But I think it's really important to do ideological analyses to see, are we open? Are we still able and free to question? Are we sort of slamming the door because we're so fervent about things that we, are just sort of stuck, to say the least? And it only gets worse from there. Awareness of hegemony in ideology, which is a little bit of what I was talking about before. This word hegemony, I know I'm using some fairly upper level stuff here. So I apologize for that, but I think this is really important because hegemony is the practice of sort of self dominance, meaning you participate in your own domination, which means that you do things that you think maybe on the surface are good for you, but what they really do is feed into the dominance that's already exploiting you. So you participate in your own self-dominance or self-exploitation. We have a lot of that going on in our society because we have a society that is built on exploitation. So examining all of that would be extremely important for students as they become adults who are trying to create a more thriving community. Hegemonic thinking is something that we would very much want to be fully aware of. So it's not just what the folks who are the exploiters, what they're doing so that they can become super wealthy and knock everybody out of their way, but use them so that they can become wealthy. This is something that we also need to be aware of because it's our own participation in those things, even though we may not be on the exploiter, fully exploiter, hyper exploiter side. probably doing some exploitation, participating in some. But we're getting our butts kicked financially. We're getting our butts kicked in a lot of ways. But we may also be adhering to ways of thinking that keep us in those spots too. That's hegemony. So looking at some of that, right? Next is the psychological and philosophical and cultural roots of sort of the meaning, purpose, and contribution here. So we would do like a psychological and a philosophical examination of the roots of things like meaning, purpose, and what we mean by contribution. Because contribution would be very contingent upon what we think about, a meaning and purpose. And then last but not least, social systems of thriving. What would those social systems of thriving be? Ecological sustainability. Again, you got to look at this ecologically from the point of liberation from greed as well. And then, again, looking at thriving theory with ecology in mind. Cooperative interspecies living practices. Woof, what does all that mean? At the ecological level, what does it mean to have species living in fairly cooperative ways with one another? Long discussion there, but something that we should look at, especially because as humans, we are very anthropocentric, meaning we put ourselves first in front of all other species. And we tend to be the most invasive species on the planet. All right. So how do we become a non-invasive, responsible species? Interspecies permacultural practices. That's a pretty cool area of understanding growing and planting and organizing. It's a very human-influenced way of creating an ecosystem, or like a mini ecosystem. It could be done in somebody's yard. It could be done in the middle of a street, as you see here in the painting. So that's some permacultural work going on there. Humans influencing it, but it also tends to be more imbalanced too. So there's impact there, but it tends to be more on the positive side. Let's see. Science and technology of sustainability. Duh. Retrofitting of ecological sustainability. How do we retrofit? That's a huge project that humans need to do. We need to retrofit all of our spaces to be much more sustainable. Quantitative and qualitative sustainability research. We can have kids certainly engaging at that at the research level, and in a way that's appropriate for their academic and cognitive levels. Philosophy of humans as nature. We have to really dive into our core understandings of how we see ourselves. Eco-ethics and ecological systems of thriving. Now this next one is just pretty much how all these things relate to one another. So I'm not going to go through this quite as much as the other two, but as you read through it, there's a lot of opportunity here to, the first two were dense enough. Now you start to make interconnections between them. Oh my goodness. So we have things here in various degrees, and perhaps some other I'll do a different discussion just on these topics and probably expand them and change them and all kinds of things, right? But this is just a little bit to get us out of the box and start thinking about this stuff. Now imagine if you did this kind of work, not just in your classroom, but across the whole school and across K to 12. And especially if it went into even more depth at a college level. Imagine what that human generation looks like after 16, 17, 18, 19 years of education with this as a core. And just to be fair, not an exclusion of other things, right? This should be a centerpiece, but not so much that there's nothing else that we learn, although this is arguably probably the most important thing that humans can do at this point, because we've screwed up so badly. And I know some people, I don't think that humans have screwed up so badly. I think that we're just good people. I think we're all trying to... Okay, do your homework. I'm not going to entertain that discussion right now, okay? So for the sake of wherever you're coming from, right? I'll just say I think we can all engage in this work. I think if we're going to take it seriously, we do have to do our homework and look at these topics, and not just do them topically and superficially. I think you could do more damage doing them at those levels. So beware. But I think we can do this kind of work sort of collectively and deeply, especially over the years, and having more and more discussion about how can we be good humans, for God's sake. Can we please? Moving down into the ways in which we think about learning. So the next part of the pedagogy here. So again, a whole video and discussion around learning theories in general, but it's not until we see learning sort of organized in this way that we get to what I would call thriving. And it has to aim towards divergent thinking, not just land on convergent thinking. So convergent thinking is basically, here's the things that we should all sort of land on together and understand together, and see that these are sort of our right answers, okay, in the easiest possible terms. Where education today tends to go is it goes to the right answers, quote unquote right answers, and then it stops there, right? And I say quote unquote because as we have been discussing for years and years and years and years, there is a white centrism there, there's a Eurocentrism there, there's other things that are going on that are producing these sort of set of right answers, and that's why I put them in quotes. And so all it means is that we do need to have a critical examination of the content, not to be so like extreme where everything is just in quotes, but definitely a meaningful critical examination of where is the information coming from. And we can do this sort of checking process as we're talking about content. Where does this come from? How do we know? What's the reliability of it? Have there been other influences in it? Not that everything comes with an agenda, but some things do. And so we can look at that. And I think education is actually going there. It's not something that should be extremist either, right? And so that's going to be something that other scholars are going to sort of argue about the degrees to which I even mean that statement. Obviously, that's an important thing to do too. But for now, at least, it is about looking at issues of power and justice and inclusion and how do we thrive together, and putting them all in that context. And if something may have an unthriving quality to it, we should investigate, right? We can still hold out for perhaps, maybe, speaking very generally here, we can still hold out for aspects of the unthriving thing that maybe we can learn from in thriving ways. So, they're, again, very generally and abstractly talking about this, but you get the idea. So we start with prior thoughts. We really focus on prior thoughts, and you spend multiple days on that. And I'll get to this more in sort of the planning of lessons video, not this one, but the next one. But the overall here is that you have these sort of phases, right? You have prior thinking, which is sort of phase one, and initial explorations of understandings, and you sort of let students go as far as they can on their own, which is really different than the way we treat prior thought right now. But you have them go as far as they can on their own with whatever broader concepts that you're talking about. And then as a teacher, of course, you do have content expertise. There we go. So that's where phase two comes in, right? You build on where they're at, and you have deeper discussions about the importance of it. And all the while, you're investigating sort of these community connections. So you have phase two is going to be sort of the deeper understandings of content, critically questioning it, lots of support and guidance from teachers. And then we start to move into more of a much more community-based effort here. So we move into a project-based. This is sort of like phase three, right? In the simplest form, a project would be a great next step with that content. A more advanced teacher could sort of interlace the projecting portions of learning with the phase 2. I think that can also be done. But for the sake of simplicity, as we're starting to just practice this and see what we understand and how well this works, it might be easier just to sort of have a phase 2 be kind of all its own. Phase 3 with the projecting. Yes, I turned that into a verb. Projecting. We need to, I think, if we're new to this, keep the project portion kind of in its own area. Anyway, for you to decide. Like, who am I? And then last but not least, of course, is truly going into the community, and providing some sort of community service, providing some sort of community engagement, contributions, something like that, right? And I should note that in phase 3 with the projects itself, there would be community-based research as well, not just research on the internet or sort of more broadly, created resources, but also understand how does our community interact, and what are the dynamics that our community seems to have with this content too. So then, when you get to phase 4, right, which is that community experience, engagement, event, whatever, community contribution, then you've made a lot of deeper thinking about the content in the context of the community and what needs there might be to address, and where those contributions are connected. So, a lot going on there, right? And then, sort of all throughout this, students are much more aware of their own paths. So we don't have this discussion with students very often. When we do, it tends to be one-off discussions. But if this was something that was more pervasive and continuous throughout the school year, the students would be very aware of what they think their own personal paths are, and out of that would come their work and their contributions. So they would be able to make these sort of deeper connections with who they think they are. A really important part of the adolescent stage, for sure. Right? Imagine if we actually supported adolescence rather than just simply making fun of it. Or feeling like it was a burden, or everybody's wonky because of hormones, and all the things that we say that are really not fair to adolescents who are going through a legit life stage. All right, so culturally responsive teaching, this is going to be an important piece of it. And I have a much longer discussion about the various ways in which we can think about that. But it's really that last, in the bottom right there. Students are learning how to grow their levels of contribution towards thriving personally and collectively, right? So there's a point here where, if we're in the context of thriving, that's where culturally responsive teaching makes sense. If we're in the context of capitalism and greed and outdoing one another in competition and eventually exploiting somebody so that you can have more money, that's not really culturally responsive teaching. That's just greed responsive teaching. No matter what culture you're tapping into, if that's your end game, then we have a discussion to have here, right? So this society, which is built heavily on greed and exploitation, I've had this discussion in other times too. The way in which we think about culturally responsive teaching right now in the context of greed and exploitation, it's lacking, to say the least, right? So we have to really think about what it means to be thriving first, before we can talk about equity, justice, inclusion, culturally responsive teaching. All of those need to be in the context of thriving. So here we have culturally responsive teaching in the context of thriving. So the aim is to be able to contribute towards continuing to make society and local communities more thriving. Individual and group differences are valued, validated, and part of open-ended exploration. And the techno-data culture of teaching, which is driven by competition and greed oftentimes. Here we are in the middle of a pandemic, and we gotta still be testing, right? Even though everybody is suffering right now in terms of schooling and levels of success and all, but we need data, right? So we're gonna keep harassing our kids. So that culture is replaced by schools aimed at protecting difference, valuing high levels of contribution, supporting children growing into their best selves. So yeah, the measure of schooling, it shouldn't be data points, based on some uh, seemingly random set of content that we constantly put in front of them, that has virtually no place in their real world other than to become somebody else's employee someday. What we should do is measure ourselves in a context of our schools really creating people who are doing very good things for their communities, right? Which could include work, by the way. I mean, this is not excluding work, but it's just a way in which work becomes the target, the bullseye for all of education all the time, and everything that we say and do. It's kind of crazy that we're so ideologically locked. There's an ideological dead end, if you will, into that particular view of education. Yeah, that's it? Just becoming somebody else's employee to make the executive class super wealthy, even though they're already super wealthy? Like, that's our job? Awesome, right? Let's be the employee class who constantly has to, struggle in order to make the executive class super wealthier. So, yeah, maybe we should have a different measure of what success looks like. Differentiation is tied to supporting children growing into their best selves and practicing making high levels of contributions that are well educated, creative, and thoughtful of others and nature. So, even differentiation in this context has a bit of a shift. So, it's not just to have the academic understanding of something and then, oh yeah, you got the right answer, woohoo, good for you, we differentiated to the point of a right answer, so cool. And then on to the next topic, right? This is a lot different because differentiation actually makes a lot more sense in this context where you're talking about individual well-being and individual and collective contributing, right, contributing. So we need to really think about how that shifts too. Anybody who gives this kind of work some deeper thought realizes that when you shift context, right, that the whole mosaic changes. It doesn't mean that you're getting rid of things. We're not starting from scratch, is what I'm saying. What we're doing is a lot of retrofitting and replacing, but a lot of retrofitting, even retrofitting inside of our brain right now. We're retrofitting this thing so that we can have a more continuous network of thinking with that kind of framework. Like we're actually changing the way in which the relationships of thoughts are happening when we change the context. Right now, we're in the context of the only thing that matters is students are pre-employees, and that success is measured upon them literally going to college and getting some, middle to upper middle class job. That is not thriving. That is incredibly dehumanizing and limiting. And what it does is it's in service to the executive wealthy class. All of this is in service to that, right? So our personal liberties, our social justices are all limited. Our social situation is limited. Our individual situation is limited. And yet somehow we're hating on each other. Whatever, right? So back to this for a second. Everything I just described, you sort of see here again sort of visually, right? You have the social piece and how it's interacting with the ecological piece. And the integrative version of all of that, and sort of where do we go as teachers and administrators and curriculum writers and curriculum designers and coaches and instructional coaches. So we have a lot here that we can do when we're using this framework. We have a lot more meaningful learning going on, and I guarantee you you're going to have a lot more kids who are feeling a lot better about themselves, even if their communities have chronic stress because they've been so screwed over uh, by, I live in New England. We have a lot of post industrial towns that have just become wastelands that we're trying to reclaim because of all these businesses that up and left. So, if one town loses tens of thousands of jobs over a decade or two, or three, that's going to have a heavy impact on everything in life, including things like cognitive engagement. So, when we're basically what we're doing here is reclaiming education with a deeper purpose in mind. Not to the point of ideological entrenchment, extremism, or dead ending it. What we need to do is be very open and exploratory, right? But at least we have a general, flexible frame here that we can keep coming back to and saying, are we doing that kind of work, right? I don't know the answers to all this stuff, but I can put together a framework that we can use to get the exploration going. The painting here by Jessica Prostein, she did an amazing job. I want to live there. I want to live in that world, right? And it's San Francisco. You can see the Trans-American Pyramid there. But I want to live in a world that has been retrofitted in this way, right? I want to live in a world that is actually aimed at thriving. I want to live in a world where people are not so selfish and greed-oriented that they're so blind to all of the terrible things that we keep engaging in, right? I want to live in a world where we actually put caring for each other first, rather than greeting for ourselves. I'm making a lot of words into weird verbs today, but that's what I'm talking about. I want to live in that world, and I'll probably die before this world is even half achieved, right? It's not utopian, but God, is it better, right? That's the world I want to live in. I am exhausted by this world, absolutely exhausted by this world. And so I want to inspire teachers to be partially exhausted by this world. It's not really an inspiring thought, but have a desire and a deep commitment towards helping kids, um, do this kind of work and become really awesome humans. That would be really cool. So anyway, moving on. Right, the next section here is about social emotional stuff, and I went through a lot of this in other videos, so I'll just keep it short here. I mentioned before the negative way in which we look at adolescence. Adolescence early and late are super important in terms of our own development. They're probably the most important stages because it's where we find ourselves. It's where we understand who we are. It's where we connect to our paths or even identify our paths. It's where we start to go, what can my contributions be? And you can see the kind of work that, in the way that I'm kind of positioning all of this, is making it contribution and path oriented, not just content oriented. Of course, it's going to be the content, and we're going to do our best to understand it in rigorous ways, but to make it connected to actually look at what we're learning and see, does it actually have this path and contribution oriented uh, potential? Okay. So, if I'm teaching science, for instance, I'm not teaching it so that everybody becomes a scientist. That's ridiculous. Not everybody is going to become a scientist, nor is everybody going to like science. But what they could do is start to figure out what their paths and contributions are in their life and to see where maybe science has a meaningful connection to the kind of path and contributions that they want to experience and provide. I would much rather have taught science at a middle school level, which I did. I would much rather have it been taught with that in mind than just simply racing through very technical content and them spitting it back at me like it's some foreign language, right? I would much rather have taught science in that kind of meaningful way. And, I made attempts as a middle school teacher to do that kind of stuff, but it's only now, after giving it a lot more thought for a lot more years, of how that experience really could have been. And it wasn't terrible then, and it was still, ahead of the mainstream, what they were doing at the time, but if I had really tapped into the stages of adolescence and helped them really dig into that part of themselves more, I think that would have been a much more empowering experience. So that's where that's coming from. So instead of just looking at stages of development broadly, in sort of these strictly cognitive ways, which we oftentimes do in education, we're looking at it more in a humanized, more purposeful way. And that work came from William Plotkin. I'm still talking about this. That work came from William Plotkin and depth psychology and all that. You don't have to adhere to this in a super strict way. You might look at this and go, "This guy's nuts." You know, I don't know. I think he is nuts in a good way. That's just me. I think I'm nuts in a good way. Clearly. Uh, so whatever, right? But at the very least, making connections between the life stage of adolescence, if we're talking about secondary education, if we're talking about uh, elementary, it's a little different. That stage two, that middle childhood time period, is really about being an explorer in the natural world. But it really starts to move in adolescence. It starts to move towards getting that deeper understanding of self and going through the mysteries, as he has there, exploring the mysteries of self in connection with the rest of the world and figuring out, who am I? Right? That's an amazing part of life. That's something that we could do a lot better. Anyway, moving on. In terms of providing the kind of supports that are needed, so right now there's PBIS and SEL and uh, I guess what I mean in restorative justice, talking about things around discipline and behavior management and that kind of stuff, right? Um, Long story short, yeah, right. You're talking to me here. Long story long. Let's be real. Steps 1 through 8 sort of go through that, and again, you see that in the SEL video that I provided a while back here. But basically, the idea here is we are humans. We're going to struggle. We're going to have lots of stress in our life, and some of us are going to have chronic stress from the day we're born because our society is so terrible and doesn't take care of people and really targets exploitation of people, which creates chronic stress. When you have chronic stress, you cannot do the best in your life. You cannot be the best person that you want to be. You can't always have access even to really good decisions that middle and upper middle class like to talk about all the time and then sort of beat over the head of people who are dealing with poverty and say, you're not making good decisions. Yeah, and sort of all of that, right? So this is really about understanding where a person is coming from and having strategies for growth and dealing with extreme emotions and but being supportive and understanding that anybody who's dealing with extreme acute stress or ongoing chronic stress is not a person who's really going to be cognitively vulnerable and want to have more stress in their life and see themselves potentially fail at something, right? It's a lot more stress to add to the system. It's not good. So to be really aware of that kind of dynamic. Okay, now getting into the actual learning experiences themselves, and why do I mention all of the things prior to this? Well, because all of those things have to be at the forefront of our thinking as we start to do a planning of a unit experience, right? So you have 3 versions of education in front of you: traditional, liberal progressive, transformative, and thriving. So the first 2 are very similar to one another. There's only some tweaking going on, even though a lot of folks who are very mainstream in education will look at that tweaking as super revolutionary, but it is not. So the traditional version obviously is about being very teacher oriented, being very assessment oriented, being very standards oriented, and not really caring about any form of difference in the class or potential for individual, really individual growth, even though we like to say that we care about individual growth. But when our whole system is not geared towards individual growth, when it's geared towards a sort of mass assimilation, yeah, right, we can do better than this. But when that's what the overall steering is towards, obviously you're not going to get a lot of really good feelings about ourselves and the contributions that we can offer. So, traditional, very all of those things oriented, ends when you do the summative exam of right answers. Liberal progressive gets a little more into individual interests and scaffolding, as we like to say. And the scaffolding is a really weird term for me. It always has been, because the scaffolding is just simply assuming that students have everything wrong or lots of things wrong, and that we're going to scaffold and provide supports to the right answer. Right? Scaffolding is a term that assumes students have a lot of wrong things going on inside their head. That's lovely, right? So as teachers, we're just, again, if the goal is just to get them to the set of right answers, then we're scaffolding them to things that they, from wrong to right, right? It doesn't give me the happy feels. But for some, they compensate by just bringing in some, individual interests, and making connections to the topics that they actually have to teach about. But even for me, that's a bit manipulative, because it's so superficial, and students, very quickly understand that that's the case, and that they're not going to really go anywhere with their personal interests in any significant way. Maybe some loose connections here and there. That's what liberal progressive is about. Whereas transformative is really about, who are you, what are your contributions, what is your path, and how do you how can you leverage what you're learning to do really good, awesome work within your community. So you start off with that initial initial phase of exploration, and then you move into sort of a deeper exploration, and then you have the projects, and then the contributions to the community, right? That's the overall there. Everything there is really aimed at the student getting to know themselves, how they think about things, what they know, and how they can contribute. All right, this is not about just having a set of right answers. It's really about, who am I in connection with this content, and who are we in connection with this content, and what can we do with it in our community. Now, if you apply sort of a project-based approach to each one of these, you still get two very limited versions of that. Even in the traditional, there's not a big difference between the traditional and liberal progressive. It would be weird to see a very traditional teacher actually doing project-based anything, because it tends to be more of a liberal progressive attempt, because it's supposed to tap into more of your personal interests. And so project-based approaches by themselves, just simply by themselves, are still very limited, unless we provide a much richer context for their existence and their practices. So again, liberal progressive here is going to have those connections to some personal interests, and at the highest level, maybe you get to some sort of national competition with the project, right? But it's still not really community-based, unless the student decided on their own to make it that way. Or a teacher, generally says, like, yeah, we can do some community-based stuff, right? But it's still not the real heartbeat of what everybody's working on. And so that's where transformative thriving picks up. So you have the project is addressing a real authentic need in the community, and then it becomes this community experience. It's also connected to personal path and contribution, right? But then you have this community event experience together, and you can go so far as to conference with other communities about these topics, right? That's a pretty powerful, empowering experience to aim your project-based learning at. Really, really different than the traditional and liberal progressive endpoints, which are basically competitive. So, learning experiences and thriving engagement. Cognitive engagement is something that follows meaning and purpose as we perceive it in our own life. So if there's meaning and purpose to it, then we will go deeper into understanding something. If it's meaningless and purposeless, then at best, we're learning it for the sake of a test, right? So we've had to create this sort of weird construct of a test to give content meaning at all, so that somebody has enough fear in themselves to get a bad grade, and so they'll learn it for the sake of the fear, which is to, um, say basically that the content matters nothing at all, except for the fact that we fear getting a bad grade. Awesome. Really, really awesome. Good job, everybody. That's the way that we've constructed learning. So we need to do better than that. So when we start to look at potential thriving engagement to some, right, in other words, more thriving engagement to really deep engagement we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing and what are the meaningful parts of this, and is this something that is going to sustain not just interest, but sustain meaning and purpose as we work in it. So anyway, you start with project-based learning, which has, as I said, has some potential here to be thriving because it inherently connects to personal interest on some level, okay? But that's just the very base level, and I would not even really call that thriving at all. As I said before in the last slide, it can fall flat, right? If it's just, um, just connected to personal, and it can fall flat. So we have to get deeper than that. But we can keep using it as a method for learning, but it's got to be tied to other things. It can't just be project-based by itself. So how do we deepen our understanding of engagement here? So problem-based learning, using the context of a real problem to learn content. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to, the way we talk about PBL is that it's just a problem. It could be a puzzle. It can be a lot of things that are a problem to figure out, but it doesn't necessarily have to be authentic. A lot of times it's contrived. It's not really something that is really authentically in our lives. So again, better, but not quite there yet. Art-based learning is something we don't talk a lot about. Art-based learning means that you're using artwork as a way to look at content and to look at tensions and look at ambiguity, perhaps, or look at possibility and nuances for sure. So there's a real offering here to use art in the class. Like, what you're really offering is, here's what an artist had thought about and worked with, and so now it's up for us to do our own interpretations to see how we think about things. Do we recognize the tensions and the relationships that the artist came up with? And then do we see things sort of in our own way, or maybe we just interpret the whole thing in a different way because of our own personal experiences and context? There's a lot there that is really interesting, right? And that's starting to connect at something deeper. So cool. I'm all for art-based learning, and I'm all for project-based learning and problem-based learning. I'm all for those things, but by themselves, they don't necessarily raise to that level. There's a lot of people in education who would, I think, feel otherwise, but as you start to put this in a larger context of what we mean by thriving and thriving theory, you start to go like, oh yeah, I guess it does sort of fall short and potentially fall flat sometimes because it's not quite there, right? But they're methods that are super helpful if you put them in that context. So generative learning is something that we also don't always see a lot of, but using student-generated interest in issues as a context for learning. So in the way that I have this sort of built throughout the unit, the initial phase is going to be really informative, and that's where the generative learning can be connected to. So I'll go through that a bit more in a little bit. So the deeper levels here are what I've already mentioned a bazillion times. Community-based learning, which obviously community engagement in the form of learning from and contributing to the community. Path-based learning, which is not the same as contribution-based learning. It's students shape their learning in response to their deeper purposes, higher selves, and paths. The paths that they see themselves on, right? And then last but not least is the contribution-based learning that comes out of that. So you have your community and you have your path, and what kind of contributions can you make with those two things in mind? also obviously connected to the content. So the unit plan can, you can change the numbers here. It doesn't have to end with 10 lessons, right? And in the real world, you might be doing a 3 or 4 week unit, maybe even more. So whatever, right? But for the sake of the project that we do in my class, it's 10 days. If you do need to expand it past that because everything's a little too tight, you can do that, by the way. So just talk to me about it. But the idea here is that you're spending at least a couple days on prior thinking, as I explained it previously. You're doing some real work on the deeper explorations of the content. You're also paralleling that with critical questioning. And then you're also paralleling that with engagement in the community, just learning from the community, right? And then it really culminates in this contribution to the community on some level, okay? So that's the pattern. Initially, seek and search for understanding on your own, independently or with somebody is totally fine. And then let's really deepen and go further from where you're at, and critically question where does it come from, critically look in the communities to see how do we understand these things in our communities, and then eventually get to community contributions. Now, the way in which that I've done this, interdisciplinary grouping of content areas of thriving pedagogy, what this is me, if you look to the right, the sort of pinky red, you see philosophy by itself, but every other subject area is really grouped. I do have philosophy by itself, and I know that we don't teach philosophy in an explicit way in schools. And if we do at all, it tends to be more in an elective at the 11th, 12th grade setting. Maybe it's sometimes mentioned in English classes. Maybe it's sometimes mentioned in history classes, but there's really not a lot of understanding to it at all. And I see college student after college student who come to me, and maybe they've had an intro to philosophy at the college level, but most often they have never had philosophy, which is terrible, because philosophy is how we think about life and what we think is important. And in this, we would have to do philosophical work around what we even think thriving looks like. And not that we're ever going to land on any one answer, right? It's something that's going to shift. And philosophically, we should keep doing that kind of work at all levels, at K through 12, right? We can ask kids and get them started in that pattern of philosophical thinking very early on. Not that we would call it philosophy to them. That would be kind of weird. Hello, kindergartner. What kind of philosophy are you doing today? Oh, you want to do nihilism? Awesome. Like, no, we're not gonna. That's not a thing. But as they go through the years and the pattern of philosophical thinking deepens, it's not something that's unfamiliar to them anymore, right? So I think it would be really awesome if public schooling included philosophy as its own subject that existed at all levels. So, yeah, that's just me. STEM, obviously the group there, and I've also included PE. Arts, you see the group there. Social studies, right, you see that there. And language, and you see those there. So the yellow, the foundation of integrative, thriving framework and mindset is something that philosophy would study over the course of the K to 12, K to 16, K to 20, however you want to, sort of put it. But it would be something that we would be studying throughout all those years. And it would be, because of the context of thriving, that's how it would look, right? Research, trials, patterns of data, innovations, inventions, health, all of those topics and practices would be a major part of the STEMs, and they would, of course, be aimed at trying to understand how do we thrive, right? What are patterns of data that help us understand what we're doing? What are research? What is research that we can do to help us understand it more deeply? What are some technological innovations that we're seeing right now, and so forth, right? And this is why PE is included there, because you have this health component in the individual well-being and collective well-being. Physical education should also be really in-depth work about what is the state of health in our communities, which you don't see a lot of that right now. In fact, you have sort of the physical experience of learning versus the health education experience of learning. I think there's a real need to evolve PE right now. It's doing its own evolution right now, for sure. It's deepening things through lenses of exercise science and health, which is great. But to now put it in the context of thriving pedagogy, I think we would see PE in an even more complex way. So, another discussion for another day, but I think that there's something really important there that, and maybe we are evolving towards that right now, but let's put that as an over explicit target, even more so. The arts would do a lot more exploration of ideas, concepts, experiences, and the outcomes connected to thriving, right? And the ways in which thriving is shortchanged, and the ways in which it is successful, and how we see it as successful. And you would see arts exploring that. Arts are always sort of at the cutting edge of thinking. And sometimes it's well formed, sometimes it's abstract, sometimes it's kind of all over the place, and that is a good thing. We want the arts to go there and do that. Social studies is a hugely important role in all of this. So your history, the current events, psychology, sociological work. Yeah, there's a lot here. Again, if it's aimed at us becoming more thriving communities, there's a lot of work that we can do there. And it's not just talking about a bunch of people who like to go to war all the time. Duh. Right? And I know social studies and history is really doing a good effort of moving past that. So they're evolving too. But the way in which that we have this sort of spectacle view of history, the troublemakers, the damage done, the big events that are sort of terrible, but we need to have a historical view of where and how and why has thriving popped up when it has. We can learn from that too. Last but not least, of course, is the languages. So you have English, ELL, and world languages there. Just a reminder that ELL, TESOL, this is a tier 1 content. That's really important to note. It's incredibly important to understand that learning English as another language is its own tier 1 experience. I know it's oftentimes confused by other content areas as a support rather than a tier 1, but it is very much its own content area, just as all the others are. So this is about looking more deeply at language as a map of constructs that organizes our views of reality. Woo-hoo-hoo! That would be fun, right? So there's obviously a deep connection with philosophy there as well, among other things that we can do. But anyway, so let's say that we're doing this interdisciplinary approach right now, right? And you have a theme. The theme is global climate change. And what you're seeing here is all the ways in which the content areas would be honing in on this topic as an interdisciplinary theme. So philosophy would explore the philosophies of exploitation and restoration, right? I think immediately you see something like that, you're like, oh my God, look at these possibilities that we're not even considering right now. Woo! Yeah, exactly. STEM would be doing the science of global climate change, obviously, be looking at the science of that and the science of restoration, because that's complex, and there's not a whole lot of agreement oftentimes in various aspects of restoration, engineering and technology of restoration, and then things like the mathematics of carbon negative, and mathematically what do we need to do as a society to achieve a carbon negative practice. Ooh, right? So there's a lot of math to figure out all throughout society that would, we need that math. We need that kind of climate change accounting for the sake of carbon negative practices. It's not enough to be carbon neutral, by the way, right? We're already way in some serious debt here. So carbon neutral means that we remain in the problematic state. We have to go backwards. We got to go back to where it's good and supportive. We got to go back to 350 parts per million at maximum, right? It's probably better if we do less than that, 325, 300. That's going to take some serious generational work from humans. So good luck with that, right? But we need to know the mathematics behind it so we can do that kind of work. What does that mean? So, arts. Exploration of greed's relationship with global climate change and social injustices. And what would the thriving vision be in connection, in direct connection to global climate change, sort of undoing global climate change? What are we aiming towards here? So the arts could do a really wonderful exploration of that, just as Jessica Pearlstein did with her picture of the woman on the rooftop in San Francisco. That kind of work. Amazing. And I don't see a lot of it out there. I see a lot of art that looks at problems and then looks at sort of, beauty and art for art's sake, but it doesn't get into sort of the direct kind of work that Jessica Pearlstein provided there. Now, you may be somebody who is familiar with that kind of art. Great. I just don't. I see it so rarely. It almost surprises me when I do see it. Social studies, industrial revolution, right? I think it's important to understand here that we have all this sort of ideological pro talk about science right now, which I'm, a science teacher, so I'm inclined to do that kind of thing too. But I also do recognize that the really important nuance here, which is that we would not have global climate change, period, if science and technology weren't attached to greed. Because it is the Industrial Revolution and the greed of the Industrial Revolution and the way that we're living all the way through now. That is the problem for global climate change, right? So science and technology have played a major role in global climate change. So having a nuanced view, not a binary view, but having a nuanced view of science isn't always good, right? It's how we use it that matters. So, we have used science and technology in extremely destructive ways. We're destroying the planet. We love war technology. We're all about that kind of stuff. So there's times when it's really important to have that nuanced view. So I think social studies would be a great place to have those kind of discussions, as well as science, for sure. Globalization, gotta look at globalization because that is another huge scourge on humans as well as on the environment. And then the eco-social reforms that are needed, right? So there's always a thriving piece to what we're talking about here. It's not just the identification of the problems, it's also what does the envisioning of that look like. Language, critical discourse analysis. Ooh, what's that? That's fun. Looking at the way in which we use terms like progress and success. What do we mean by that? And what are some other words that are connected to that and meanings that are connected to that? Linguistic patterns of ideology, right? And that's just sort of scraping the surface here. There's so much work that we can do just in the languages alone. There's storytelling that goes with this, right? There's really important fictional works that can be done here. You could do, instead of steampunk, you could do like a thrive punk, where we were writing stories about thriving and using some creative writing practices around that and so forth. So there's a lot here. There's an enormous amount of work that could be done just on this global climate change theme itself. So, hoo-da-lally. We're in it, my friends. We are in it. Overall framework of thriving pedagogy and outcomes. So the green here is the framework, and the yellowy one is the pedagogy, and then the blue one is the overall outcomes of having years of experience with that kind of pedagogy in connection with that kind of framework. So here, this is all applied to philosophy. So I'm going to go through the groups of content areas. And remember, philosophy I just have by itself. Some might say, well, isn't that a social studies? Yeah, it is a social studies, right? But it's so important that it really actually needs to be taught just by itself continuously, in my view. As somebody who teaches philosophy, I see the importance of it. So at this particular stage in the slideshow, what I'm not going to do is really read things word for word. You're going to have to go through it yourself, okay? But I will do the philosophy one since I know nobody is teaching philosophy explicitly. So here's how this works. If you go to the yellow column here, the 3 bullets there in the yellow one, I took those and put them on top on this slide. What that means is to take each one of those pedagogies. You have the pedagogy of philosophy in connection with well-being, a pedagogy of philosophy in connection with sustainability, and the connection of philosophy with thriving and democratic decision-making and how communities operate, right? So you have well-being, sustainability, and then the overall sort of operations of thriving communities. Cool, right? What does that look like when you take those 3 huge sort of pedagogy approaches and start to articulate maybe how do we teach this, right? So, like I said, I'm just going to do this for philosophy. You can look through your content areas to see how it applies. But basically, from a philosophy point of view, you have a deep and continuous examination of concepts of self, community, and their dynamics with each other. You have a deep and continuous examination of well-being and its relationship with growth, change, critical analysis, and tensions with individuality and collectivity. And you have a history of philosophies and their contexts that address thriving at the individual and collective levels and application of those understandings to contemporary contexts. Yep, I'm going there. That's some deep stuff, right? This is not. This is the language that I'm put here is it's up there. I know that. And I know teachers looking at this are like, oh my God, like, where's the workbook for this? Right? There is no workbook for this. Right? You're a teacher. You're awesome. You can do this. So, okay, the complex language is not meant to throw you off. The complex language is actually meant to make people think, and then think about their content areas and go, how can I do that? And you do bits and pieces at a time. That's how you do it. It's not something that you can do all at once, but you keep coming back to this going, where am I doing this? How am I doing this? Am I doing this? Is our curriculum written in a way that does this? So the middle column there is the same kind of stuff, but philosophy connected to sustainability. So deep and continuous examination of how sustainability interacts with self and community dynamics. Examination of a mindset of reciprocity, in other words, equal exchanging, giving and taking, especially in the context of social and ecological sustainability. Critical examinations of dialectics, okay, sorry, I can't help it, but if you're doing philosophy, you know what dialectics are, so there. Dialectics is sort of this swinging back and forth to the extremes so that we can understand what we can do. So you test it out over here, you test out the idea over here, and you start to inch your way towards maybe the middle, but maybe not. Maybe there's something that you're seeing where there is a push and a pull to a side that makes more sense, right? But what you're effectively doing is learning from both sides so you can make some decisions, right? Or you're learning from the polar opposites and everything along the way in the spectrum. So that's a dialectic. Sorry. So a critical examination of those, because we don't want to be polarized, but we want to learn from the polar ends. Not that they're divisive, right? Dialectic doesn't necessarily mean that they have this divisive quality to them. It just means that as we think along the spectrum, the full spectrum, we see how perhaps we're learning from all the aspects of the full spectrum, so we can make some decisions with all that stuff in mind. Not easy, but a process that we can ultimately look at more closely and become more comfortable with. So there. Sorry again, I used a big word. So, examinations of dialectics and tensions, that should make a lot more sense now, that are always present in our decisions and our practices of individual and community considerations as we attend to things like social and ecological sustainability. And last but not least here is the thriving side, right? Authentic and deep explorations of integrative thriving, seeing how those things are all interconnected. Deep examinations of how we think about democratic decision making and its impact on local and global communities. And examine how thriving is not a static construct, but one that is going to change and be informed by diverse voices and perspectives all along the way, as it should, right? This is not something that should, once again, be driven by whiteness and maleness and straightness and all kinds of things that are in the dominant place of, you sort of force everybody out. This is real deep, thriving inclusion, to say the least. And so, yeah, right, that's philosophy. So you can do that with each one of the content areas. So STEM, arts, social studies, language, right? So now we're at the level of assessment, and each content area is going to have some of that going on, and that is connected to the outcomes column. So the middle column is what was driving, that was the pedagogy column for each one of the content areas. Now this one is the right column, the blue column, that is what we're going to pay attention to. So it's the outcomes, right? So in a thriving context here, assessments in a unit are going to have, again, a little bit of a different feel. So if our goal here is to make a more thriving community, that if that's our collective project, and we have sort of a commitment as individuals and groups to do that kind of work, and if we're going to have purposeful contributions be the end point for the learning experience now, right? I mean, I'm just going to take a breath for a second, because I'm just sort of imagining a world where school is actually using contributions as the end of units, and learning experiences. That's amazing to me. I mean, I'm actually getting a little choked up right now. I can feel, because that would be so much better than just jamming useless crap into our heads. Yeah, I want to live in that world. I want my kids to live in that world. I want my teachers to feel like they're doing some amazing, rewarding, just life-affirming kind of work. That, yeah, right? And this is why I'm in education at all. So it all comes down to this, right? So that purposeful contributions is the end point of learning. Have we really learned something if we cannot contribute with that in mind? Right. So the assessments themselves are built towards contributing to creating a more thriving community. And that's what we're actually assessing for. I friggin' love that. Sorry, Frig. Right. Yeah, that would be amazing. So, yeah. Okay. With that in mind, now you can go through each one of your content areas and see the outcomes themselves are now the focal points here, right? So within the well-being, for the philosophy, the well-being outcomes that we can assess for, in various ways, all throughout the different age groups and grade levels, here's what they would look like. People who are seeking deeper understandings of interconnections between public health, thoughtfully guided technology, and a common well-being that we individually and collectively experience. Again, really big, bulky statement here, but you start to tease out different parts of this, and you bring it to the level that's appropriate for the kid at the life stage that they're at, and the cognitive sort of ways of thinking about things. You have a lot going on in just that one bullet point right there, right? People who are seeking to have deeper understandings, philosophical understandings of these interconnections between all of these aspects of society, right? And we can assess for that at a philosophical level, and we can see how the philosophy of that, just that alone, is manifesting itself into a contribution, right? We can get there. This is just a starting point. There's a lot more work to be done to turn that into an actual practice. I get that, but this is something that we can actually do, right? So the second one, people who quell desires of greed and profit so that the collective health and advancement can be achieved with care and integrity. We can assess for that kind of thing. Again, that sounds like, it's the base for a contribution. The base for a contribution, meaningful contribution, would be one of the contributions themselves can just be, how do we stop greed in its tracks, right? How do we monitor greed so that we can do something about it? How do we change our own core thinking and philosophy so that greed isn't not the reason for even thinking about things? So people who are guided by ideals that raise public health and well-being to their highest level so that a foundation of stability can help us to face challenges. So again, this is where philosophy is so important, is because it's a foundation of hopefully clarity in our thinking that gets us to a point where we do have this sort of upper tier level of well-being that also gives us sort of enhanced endurance for dealing with problems. And we need that, right? We should not just constantly feel beaten down, which we oftentimes do, especially in this society right now. The failures of our society are so profound and they're so pervasive that we're all feeling that kind of the heaviness. But if we deepened our philosophical understandings, there would be so much more that we can do to build our well-being, which also builds our endurance to face challenges. So if you never found philosophy to be terribly important before, we have a lot of work that we can do here that's actually quite positive. So along similar lines, and looking at the sustainability parts of that, we're going to have a lot of philosophical work that we can do there. We can dialogue between the ideologically entrenched mindsets. We can use philosophical analysis as an important part of working with social and ecological challenges. We can have people who are sort of teaching next generations to build integrative mindsets, right? Our kids themselves can have all of these qualities and become teachers of integrative mindsets themselves. Not ideologically entrenched and imprisoned mindsets, but open mindsets, flexible mindsets, questioning mindsets. Ones that do say sometimes, we need a certain level of reliability before we can move or whatever. I mean, there's so many things that we can do here. And the reason why I'm being sort of broad and general here is because there's so much that you can offer, right? You're not me, I'm not you, and you have so much more as you go on, right? Than I will. I'm just hopefully providing a base that you all, in your own diverse ways, can do this kind of work. And that is really what we want, right? We want kids to see different teachers, teachers who are grappling with different philosophies and perspectives, and doing so in a way that's not about indoctrination, but doing it in a way that's about growth and exposure and about contribution, right? And difference is so crucially important to our existence. And deeply loving and caring and supporting difference is so incredibly important. Not difference of intolerance, right? Not difference of destruction. Not that. Not well. There's certain kinds of destruction that we kind of need, right? But not destruction of person. Definitely, if there's a destruction at all, maybe I could, sort of get to this place where it's like a destruction of past selves, right? That maybe destruction is not quite the right word there. Maybe it's a shedding of past selves. But you get the idea here, right? These are the kind of discussions and work, and I would love to teach philosophy at the secondary level, especially, and really work with kids around thinking of this. This would be amazing. Maybe I'll come back in my next life and teach philosophy at the high school level. I don't know. Anyway, philosophical examination of integrative thinking, or integrative thriving. My apologies. So here we have that sort of everything is interconnected philosophical analysis that we're going to do. So, people who use philosophical analysis as an important part of designing and implementing social and technological practices that address and support deeper integrative ecological and social sustainability. And I'm sure at this point you're like, oh my God, can you please stop? No. Look, this is, if you break just that one down, you have social and technological practices and how they're integrative with one another. And we need philosophy to help us sort of gauge whether or not these are appropriate ways of trying things out. We're never going to have anything that's perfect, and it's sort of a dumb. I think it's a ridiculous goal to ever have. I'm always in favor of better, much better, in fact. But that's what we're talking about here, right? So we are going to make mistakes as humans. We're going to make a lot of mistakes, but we can keep trying. We can keep learning from it, and that's what this is about. And having that philosophy to keep us sort of steady. Well, okay, maybe that's it. Maybe that's not, right? But let's go back to the way we're thinking and see if the outcome matches the way that we were thinking about this. And if it doesn't, maybe it's actually positive. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's negative. That's what philosophy can do for us. The second one there, people who draw upon both research and philosophy to collectively and dialogically, just means talk. Make decisions and account for unintended consequences. Could you imagine politicians who actually did a really good job of this and did not entrench themselves in an ideology before they did this kind of work? I right? Dare I even put that out there? People who work peacefully through difference of core values and philosophies. So if the general goal is to be a more thriving community, there's certain things that certainly would not be tolerable. One is intolerance itself. Two is sort of denial and invalidation of people's experiences, right? Now, it's not that we wouldn't have like nuanced discussions around some of these things, because there oftentimes is a revisiting that has to happen. But if thriving itself is the context, that sort of keeps us on track of where we can keep going. Identifying problems is always going to be part of this, always, but it's not the end point either. And that's where I think critical philosophies and critical practices tend to fall short, is they're identifying problems and not always piecing together. Maybe there's an inferring, but there's not this sort of, hey, what can we do? What can we envision? Where do we go from here to? Identifying the problems is part of it, a very important one. But the way in which we sort of proceed and where we're aiming towards is also crucial. Okay, so other content areas, all the same groupings, and then I'm ending here with, if we took assessments with that kind of aim in mind, where the assessments are built towards contribution, not just towards the right and wrong answers, what would that really look like? So you can see each one of the greenish boxes here, and what I'm sort of highlighting is, in each one of them, is sort of what the core, right? Because they all have very similar sentence structures, but it's just a critical examining of what. And so you see that changing, that what is changing for each one of the content groups. So, and the reason why I have my kids here, these are my 5 kids, and the reason why I have them here is because, knowing them, I know that each one of them have a different place that places that are really their interests and where they tend to flourish. And that's the larger point. As teachers, it's not about sort of forcing everybody into a box and everybody is the same and everybody has to achieve similar outcomes and all that. And what we really need to do is help our kids grow along their paths. And if their paths change, we help them grow along the new one. So here are all my elementary aged kids, and they're just really coming into their own. We have Audrey, the youngest, at 1st grade, and Amaya, the oldest, in 5th grade. And the experiences of them growing into the best version of themselves is really, really, really the goal. because the best version of themselves is somebody who is contributing to a more healthy, balanced, caring, thriving community. So, as they grow, their emphases might change. And if you sort of look over, you see, like William, for instance, is kind of everywhere, right? He has a lot of broad interests. But if you look at Kai and Dylan, they tend to be a bit more concentrated, right? So, that's the point. Everybody's a little bit different, and that is good. Let people be different, right? And at our core state, of course, we know that we're interconnected. We're always interconnected. Um, but if a real meaningful assessment uh, is what we're looking for here, here it is, right? Let people move along their paths and encourage them to move along their paths. Don't just let them. Be supportive of that and help them find ways to make contributions along their paths as connected to the various content groups and areas and whatnot. And if it's not quite their content, then that's fine too, but help them practice it. And they're not failing if it's not their most favoritist thing in life, right? They do have a path, and let's recognize and respect that. So I hope that was enjoyable, because that was long. That was really long. I am hungry. I am tired. I am going to go. I hope you're doing well. Take care.